Within the world of fantasy, there are numerous genres and subgenres, but while many have clear indicators and qualifying factors, there is one subgenre that stands out in particular, one categorized mainly by gut reaction and overall aesthetic: dark fantasy. Not to be confused with grimdark fantasy, which I'll explain in a second, is one of the most underrated subgenres out there in my opinion. Growing up, I was no fan of horror movies, and absolutely hated the idea of going to haunted houses, yet somehow, dark fantasy was able to transcend my aversion to fear, and many projects in the genre still stand as some of my favorites of all time. There is just something about the combination of horror and fantasy that managed to pique my interest enough to overcome my childhood fright. Recently, there has been a trend going around online, where people will utilize AI to imagine dark fantasy versions of characters from popular series. And beyond providing a bit of fun, these videos have caused me to reflect on the subgenre as a whole, and ponder why exactly I, like so many others, love this aesthetic so much. It can sometimes be challenging to decide what does and doesn't fit into the subgenre of dark fantasy. The majority of reasoning you see online tends to boil down to, well, it feels like a dark and twisted story, so it counts. And 9 out of 10 times I do feel like dark fantasy projects are labeled correctly, though I'm not always sure there's a clear understanding as to why it qualifies outside of this gut reaction I mentioned. For this video, I wanted to explore what exactly dark fantasy is, and try to see if we can set some criteria for qualifications. Also, if you haven't already, consider subscribing and commenting down below. I love engaging with the comment section, and I try to respond to as many people as I can. Now without further ado, here is my breakdown of dark fantasy. Going as far back as 1917, author Gertrude Burroughs Bennett wrote a number of fantasy stories that first began the theme of dark fantasy, though the term would be coined later on. Originally imagined as a blend of horror, fiction, and fantasy, these stories would go on to inspire many elements of what we understand the genre to be today. Whereas many normal fantasy stories include a fantastical or whimsical world, dark fantasy twists those expectations into something sinister, making it crystal clear that this is not a realm you would want to find yourself in. The main difference between dark fantasy and grimdark fantasy is not too dissimilar from the difference between low fantasy and high fantasy. Grimdark refers to stories reflecting on moral ambiguity, gritty realism, and a bleak outlook on the world. Stories like A Song of Ice and Fire and Mistborn Era 1 would fit nicely into the grimdark category. Dark fantasy, however, focuses on the blending of fantasy and horror, with an elevated emphasis on supernatural horror. Now, outside the aesthetic classifications, most dark fantasy projects, especially those found within the visual medium, typically have a very distinct vibe and atmosphere established to set it apart from other fantasy works. The first major qualifier I would like to add, which I feel is necessary for adding in that iconic dark fantasy flavor, is the involvement of outer gods, or cosmic horrors beyond comprehension. Many of the greatest dark fantasy worlds achieve their iconic eeriness through establishing an air of confusion which permeates throughout the entire setting. We as an audience aren't supposed to understand why things are the way they are. And a great example of this is the series of games from the studio From Software, commonly referred to as Soulsborne games. In these games, the plot from the perspective of a casual gamer is incredibly straightforward. The player character serves as some form of knight who moves throughout the world of the game, indiscriminately killing horrid abominations and beautiful, ethereal beings alike. It almost feels like there is no rhyme or reason to the plot, and the only goal is to simply kill whatever stands in your way until the game is over. This adds to that level of uncertainty, and in the games, we can feel on the surface that there is a sad and tragic history to whichever kingdom we are exploring. Yet, upon closer inspection, you can learn more about that story and discover what your character's role in the plot truly is. This is part of why I love dark fantasy, since it is almost always a straightforward aesthetic experience. But if you are willing to put in the effort, there is endless lore and world building you can explore. Expanding upon the outer gods trope, this seems to be a factor that plays into almost every example of dark fantasy. Whereas most regular fantasy series tend to derive their plot mainly from the conflict between good and evil, dark fantasy never tends to be that straightforward. There is almost always some existential threat that looms over the story, and the eeriness and uncertainty that exist as a result is but one tool used to capture that iconic atmosphere. A good example would be comparing 3 characters, King Kong, Godzilla, and Cthulhu. Now, on the surface level, these 3 all seem very similar and serve as giant, imposing monsters. But what sets a monster like Cthulhu apart from the others? Well, for starters, we don't know anything about their origins. They are an outer being from beyond space and time. Their goals are unknown to the audience, and unlike King Kong and Godzilla, who serve as physical threats, Cthulhu is almost entirely a psychological threat, causing madness to anyone who gazes upon them. This is another reason why I love dark fantasy and find it so enjoyable. Because while more often than not you can pack an interesting story full of complex mysteries to unravel, dark fantasy is meant to be simply fun. Of all the fantasy genres, this is the easiest to just turn your brain off and simply enjoy, soaking in the atmosphere and taking the time to appreciate the hard work and effort that went into crafting such an artistically beautiful world. There have been many dark fantasy projects that have come out over the years, and I wanted to go ahead and list a few that I think are well worth the experience. If you have any dark fantasy stories of your own that you enjoy, feel free to recommend them in the comments down below. Starting off, I need to mention Berserk. Since my last fantasy analysis videos, I received numerous comments telling me that I forgot to include Berserk. While I personally haven't gotten around to reading or watching the series yet, I did watch some analysis of the story and world and have to admit, it does look really cool. I'm still trying to find a financially feasible way to experience Berserk, but it is high up on my list, and I trust my audience enough to include it in the list of things I can vicariously recommend. I already mentioned the Soulsborne games, but I would like to put an extra emphasis on Elden Ring, which has been my favorite entry in the series. Mostly because out of all the games in the genre, this one leans heavily on exploration and lets you approach content and bosses at your own speed, whereas the other games from Software are incredibly linear. While I do often prefer linear games to open world, Elden Ring for me is a strong exception, due to the ability to find items and level up before approaching a boss, rather than needing to simply get good, as many fans of the genre will often smugly recommend. This is also the entry with which I've spent the most time researching and understanding the lore, and it is incredibly cool and complex. George R.R. Martin, author of Game of Thrones, also helped write the lore of this game, which I think is really neat. On the film side of dark fantasy, my favorite examples are Dark Crystal and Pan's Labyrinth. I don't have a ton to say about the Dark Crystal, and I'll admit it's been a long time since I've watched it, but a dark fantasy movie directed by Jim Henson and Frank Oz, starring a Muppet cast? I mean, come on, what's not to love? And Guillermo del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth is a project I would label as low dark fantasy. But nonetheless, it is a really cool movie, and Guillermo del Toro is one of my favorite directors. On another note, if you want a dark fantasy claymation movie, then you should check out his Pinocchio adaptation, which actually kinda does meet my criteria for dark fantasy. Lastly, and before I give my final suggestion, I know that there are many things I didn't get around to mentioning, so be sure to leave your favorites in the comments down below and I'd love to check them out. But my absolute favorite dark fantasy project has got to be Hollow Knight. First off, can we just agree that indie game developers need more appreciation? I am constantly being blown away by the effort and love poured into some of these titles, especially in a day and age where it feels like AAA studios are just pumping out these lackluster cash grabs. Ranting aside, Hollow Knight is such an unbelievably cool dark fantasy world. Basically, just imagine Redwall, but instead of these little forest critters, they're bugs. And instead of European medieval fantasy, it's a subterranean dark fantasy ecosystem, which is absolutely bursting with these imaginative and fully realized sectors for you to explore. This game also feels incredibly straightforward upon first glance. You're a little bug character, and you need to go underground and kill other bugs. But if you go down the rabbit hole, Hollow Knight lore goes hard. Also, the music is just immaculate. I cannot recommend this one enough. While some people don't enjoy dark fantasy for the same reason that some people don't enjoy horror, I can't stress enough that it is an incredibly underrated genre and deserves more love. Now, granted, I don't love the horror genre, so I can't judge too much, but if you are curious about experiencing dark fantasy and seeing what all the hype is about, be sure to come back and let me know what you think. I've had a blast making videos over this last month, and while it started out as a way merely to keep myself busy during my job hunt, I've come to genuinely enjoy getting these videos out and interacting with the fantasy community. I can't promise that I will manage to maintain weekly uploads moving forward, but I would still like to make an effort to build up this community. And getting to talk about what I love is always fun. Thank you again to everyone who has subscribed so far. It really does mean a lot to me. And I hope to see you all again soon.